Teenage boy mocks elderly cashier, unaware of her inspiring story. Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance or age, only to regret it later? We all make assumptions, but sometimes we forget that the people we mock or overlook might have stories that could change our perspective forever. This is the story of a teenage boy who mocked an elderly cashier, only to find out her past was far more inspiring than he could have ever imagined. Prepare to be moved by a tale of resilience, humility, and the unexpected lessons life has to offer. The sun was beginning to set over the small town, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets. The local grocery store was a hub of activity as customers rushed to stock up for the evening. In the corner, behind the cash register, stood Margaret Williams, a woman in her early 70s. Her silver hair was neatly pulled into a bun, and her wrinkles were a testament to the many years she had lived. She had worked at the store for over a decade, her hands steady as she scanned items with practiced ease. Though Margaret had always been kind, her age and quiet demeanor often went unnoticed by the bustling customers around her. Most didn't give her a second glance as they hurried to grab what they needed and rush off to their next destination. She was a fixture in the store, part of the furniture, and to many, just another elderly woman behind the register. But Margaret wasn't bothered by the lack of attention. She had her own purpose, and the job gave her the chance to interact with people, even if they didn't always notice her. On this particular afternoon, a teenage boy named Jake entered the store. He was in his late teens, dressed in the latest fashion, a graphic t-shirt, ripped jeans, and a snapback cap turned backward. His earbuds were in, and he barely looked up as he grabbed a few snacks and headed toward the register. Jake was the type of boy who often walked around with a cocky attitude, his swagger evident in the way he carried himself. He approached Margaret's register, barely acknowledging her presence. With a slight smirk, he dropped his items onto the counter and glanced at her. "Hey, Granny," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You still working here? Must be pretty boring, huh?" Margaret looked up at him, her expression calm. She smiled softly, not taking offense. "It's a good job, young man," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I've always liked meeting new people." Jake rolled his eyes and continued with his taunting, his words laced with the impatience of someone who thought they knew everything. "You must be really desperate to still be working at your age. I mean, come on, it's not like you need the money, right?" Margaret paused for a moment, scanning his items with precision but didn't respond immediately. Her smile never faltered, but something behind her eyes seemed to hold a deeper understanding. Jake, oblivious to any deeper meaning, paid for his snacks with a few crumpled bills, still chuckling under his breath. As he grabbed his change and started to walk away, he threw one last taunt over his shoulder. "See you later, Granny. Hope you don't break a hip or something." He made his way out of the store, his earbuds back in, leaving Margaret standing there in silence. She shook her head slightly but didn't let it bother her. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about her, and it wouldn't be the last. But little did Jake know, Margaret was more than just the elderly cashier behind the counter. She was a woman whose life had been anything but ordinary. That evening, as Jake walked home, he felt a sense of satisfaction from his little interaction at the store. He often mocked older people, especially those working in what he saw as dead-end jobs. To him, Margaret was just a typical old woman, stuck in a rut, doing something boring for the sake of a paycheck. He had no interest in learning about her or her life. But that night, Jake's perspective would begin to shift in ways he never could have imagined. The next day, Jake's mom sent him on an errand to the same grocery store. He hadn't thought much about Margaret since their brief exchange the day before, but as he entered the store again, he noticed something unusual. There was a small crowd gathered around the customer service desk, and a few employees were speaking in hushed tones. Curious, Jake wandered over to see what was happening. As he neared, he overheard a conversation between the store manager and a few employees. "It's just so hard to believe," the manager was saying. "I never knew. She was such a quiet woman. All this time she never mentioned it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" One of the employees looked at him, her face serious. "It's about Margaret. You didn't know, did you?" Jake shook his head, confused. "Know what?" The employee looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "Margaret isn't just some old cashier. She was a war hero. She was one of the first women to serve in the army back in the 1950s. She was stationed overseas and participated in missions that saved countless lives. After that, she worked as a nurse, helping people in war-torn countries. She never once talked about it, but the truth came out when we got a letter from one of the families she helped." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had no idea. He had just assumed that Margaret was a typical elderly woman working a simple job, but the reality was far different. He had mocked her without knowing the strength and resilience that lay behind her soft smile. As Jake stood there, the weight of his actions began to sink in. He had made fun of a woman who had lived a life filled with challenges, sacrifice, and courage. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. "Jake?" He turned around to see the manager approaching him with a concerned look on his face. "You've been coming here a lot lately, haven't you?" Jake nodded, his guilt making it hard to speak. The manager continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you probably didn't mean anything by it, but mocking someone like Margaret, it's not right. She's not just a cashier. She's a hero, and she's one of the strongest people we know." Jake's mind raced. He had no idea how to respond. He felt ashamed, but he knew he had to make it right. He had to apologize. For the first time, Jake realized that his words had power, that they could hurt people in ways he didn't fully understand. The following day, Jake returned to the store with the intention of finding Margaret and apologizing for his thoughtless remarks. As he approached her register, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure how to start, but he knew it was important to make amends. Margaret was standing behind the counter, smiling at a customer, as always. When she saw Jake, her expression softened, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had likely remembered his mocking tone from the day before. She didn't say anything, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. "Margaret," Jake began, his voice sincere, "I owe you an apology. I said some really hurtful things to you yesterday, and I didn't know the first thing about your life. I had no right to judge you, and I am really sorry." Margaret's smile returned, but this time it held a sense of understanding. "Jake, it's okay. You didn't know," she said softly, "but I appreciate your apology." Jake took a deep breath. "I was rude, and I shouldn't have said what I did. I'll never make the mistake of judging someone based on their age or their job again. I've learned a lot." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "It's not about what others think of you. It's about how you carry yourself and what you do with the life you're given. If you remember that, you'll do just fine." From that day forward, Jake made a conscious effort to be kinder and more respectful to those around him. He didn't forget the lesson he had learned from Margaret, a woman who had lived a life full of courage, compassion, and strength. And Margaret, for her part, continued her work at the store, a quiet hero whose story had touched the lives of those who took the time to truly see her. The world may have judged Margaret based on her age or appearance, but those who truly knew her understood the depth of her character. And for Jake, this was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. This story reminds us that we should never judge others based on assumptions or appearances. Every person has a story, and sometimes those stories are filled with more resilience and strength than we could ever imagine. Just because someone is elderly or works a job that seems simple doesn't mean they don't have an incredible story to tell. Let's remember to treat everyone with respect, because the next person you dismiss could be someone who has overcome more than you could ever fathom.